Numerous reports indicate that manufacturing has emerged as the favorite target of ransomware groups and hackers. In response, a new report from Industrial Media discusses the evolution of industrial cybersecurity, its current state, and the tactics hackers are using, including phishing schemes, malware, and ransomware attacks. It also details solutions in arming manufacturers with the knowledge and resources needed to win more fights on this highly complex and ultra-competitive battlefield. Download the industrial sector's new battlefield by going to manufacturing.net/cyber. Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Now, like many of you, I recently dove into Verizon's 2024 Data Breach Investigations Report, and if you haven't looked at it, we'll put a link in this episode. But while there's a plethora of data housed in the report that could fuel conversations on a multitude of topics, I chose the following two pieces of information. First, there's Verizon's Ways In analysis. And it talked that while credential harvesting and phishing attacks still lead the way in terms of how people are getting into your networks, the use of exploitable vulnerabilities to access those networks tripled from last year and were primarily leveraged by ransomware and other extortion-related threat actors. The main entry point in all these situations was web applications. The second data set to get my attention was the continued growth of phishing attacks. In fact, the reported median time to click on a malicious link after an email is opened is 21 seconds, and then only another 28 seconds for the person caught in the phishing scheme to enter their data. Basically, a successful phishing attack can be executed in less than 60 seconds. These two items caught my eye because they seem like the low-hanging fruit when it comes to cybersecurity. Vulnerabilities and their related patches are constantly being published by suppliers and CISA, yet their use by the black hats continues to grow. The only reason is that we're not keeping up with the bad guys when it comes to filling these gaps in our defenses. Similarly, not falling for malicious emails is 101 level training and education, yet it continues to yield dividends for the bad guys. Granted, new tools like AI have enabled hackers to optimize these strategies, but at their basis, these are highly manageable risks. Here to discuss some of these exploits along with their corresponding mitigation strategies is Roland Cozzolino, CTO and CIO of InsightCyber, a global provider of asset visibility, risk management, and security services delivered via an AI-driven platform. Roland, thanks for joining us, and welcome to Security Breach. So, hey, I'm going to throw you kind of a loaded question here to start things off. We know, especially on the OT side of things, the attack landscape is getting bigger and bigger pretty much by the minute as we connect more stuff. So there's lots of different variables here. And I'll kind of let you take this wherever you want to go. But what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of how this is affecting risk mitigation strategies, the way hackers are coming at the OT environment, or even some of this we've got just influx of tools that are also being used as well. What are some of the biggest changes or different things that you're seeing take place because of this?
Even if you look backwards a little bit at like something that's really not that long ago, like you look at Colonial Pipeline, you start to get this sense that there is a massive impact that can happen across the OT environment, especially knowing how a simple manipulation within code running on a Raspberry Pi could potentially affect a robot that could swing its arm at 500 miles an hour and kill factory workers, let alone, take out an entire plant. So that's what starts to scare me.
Yeah, or shut it down. I mean, we've seen an influx of those denial of service attacks as well.
Yeah. Oh, without a doubt. And you're going to get a significant amount of those, I believe. Although I will say that DDoS attacks are generally easier to recognize, but what they do is they bring things to a crawl. Modbus manipulation scares the hell out of me because you can do it now. I can walk into a plant, hack into their whatever's running their stuff, send some Modbus commands, and lo and behold, you have no idea what I'm doing.
No, we're seeing a lot of more of those. People use dwelling attacks or live off the land type of attacks where the hackers get in and they just kind of hang out for a while. Are you seeing that impacting different parts of the OT environment as well, or having a bigger effect maybe moving ahead?
I believe that the OT environment is very, very suspect to, or not suspect, is very, very vulnerable to attacks from, we'll call them hackers for lack of a better term, but for people who are looking to generate ransom and money and all that sorts of stuff. That, while that is very discomforting, it's not the one that scares me as much, only because they have one goal in mind, which is to make as much money as they can due to taking over your facility. The other ones are the ones that really, really scare me, which is literally taking out a nuclear plant and or a hydroelectric plant, whatever you want to call it. And those are intended to disrupt the industry in a massive way.
Are you seeing those types of hackers, again, if we're trying to find this sort of cover-all term, are they adjusting their ways of going about things, or are they still relying on some of the old school stuff?
I believe that the general hackers looking for ransomware, trying to make money, are looking to buy new stuff, but they're still using relatively antiquated code that they buy in the dark market. But that's easy to discover. The other side is without me naming countries, because it would sound, I don't want to sound like I'm picking countries that exploit anything, but there are countries that are looking to disrupt you in a massive way. And those are the ones that concern me way more than ransomware attacks. And I know that that's what the Joint Cyber Task Defense Committee and the Joint Ransomware Task Committee and all these these guys are looking at that, and they're trying to diagnose what is going on in a reliable fashion such that they can prevent and or recognize when attacks are happening in real time. That makes me more comfortable.
Yeah. As far as why these folks are more scary, I mean, there's 10 different reasons why, I guess. I'd be interested just because of your background and your insight. You've dealt with cyber warfare for a little bit now. What is the dynamic in terms of how they're constructed, how they operate, that maybe keeps you awake a little bit more at night thinking about those guys?
So a significant number of them will launch attacks based off of relatively easily recognizable traits. It could be from spoofing MAC addresses to malformed Ethernet types, like all of this stuff. They try to utilize, and a lot of the ransomware does. Like that's literally its goal, right? It wants to hit the mother home, and it's going to do it using any means possible. And that isn't necessarily the best approach, knowing that if you can recognize these faults in the system, it's easy. The other companies, I mean, if you look at something as old as Olympic Games, right? Which hopefully most of your audience knows, Olympic Games was, if you don't, Olympic Games was the US and Israel trying to combat Iran's creation of nuclear facility and centrifuges. And if you saw the way that that attack was approached, it was done in a very methodical, off the beaten path pattern that exploited a person to get it in the first place.
Okay.
And once they got it in, nobody knew what was going on because the systems acted as if everything was good. I mean, it'd be like, it's like a movie, right? It's like taking a picture of a film and showing it over and over and over again in the same reel, and you see nobody walking down the hallway, and it constantly runs, and everybody's walking down the hallway. Those are the ones that can be very, very frightening because those become way harder to detect, and you have to have significantly more intelligence to understand that the big attacks are slow rolled when they're done correctly. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, the patience of some of these state-sponsored bad actors is pretty amazing in terms of how long they'll hang out and just take information until they're really ready to sort of unleash the full load of what they want to bring to the table. It is frightening.
Yeah.
I would agree. You know, you mentioned a couple, I'm sorry. You mentioned a couple of things there, Roland, in terms of some of the new stuff that the bad guys might be using. You also mentioned intelligence gathering. Well, I know in our preliminary back and forth, you also have an extensive background in artificial intelligence, which there's no way we can talk about OT cybersecurity right now without talking about AI. So I'd kind of like to get your feel in terms of where are we right now? How are we doing? We know the bad guys seem to always be a step ahead, but where do we stand in terms of AI right now?
So one of the approaches we've been taking is really understanding. I mean, if you think of something as, it's going to sound ridiculous. If you think of something as simplistic, um, we'll start really simple first, and then I'll get a little bit more complicated. If your neighbor's house is on fire, what would be a bad thing to do to your house? Probably you don't pour gasoline on it, right? I mean, unless you really want that thing to burn down, you spray it with water, right? Now, in today's world, they've approached the world very similarly to a militaristic style of defense of trench warfare, which is you send out that line of defense up and ahead who you know they're going to get slaughtered and 90% are going to die. And you hope that you can cause a retreat. And if you don't, at least they can have diminished a significant number. And then you can attack them from the trenches. So it's flow and flow and flow and flow and flow. So now let's apply that to cybersecurity. So in cybersecurity, how does that work? Well, I hire a whole bunch of guys to examine everything that happens in real time now. Now, what is the odds of them really caring is the wrong word, but really being able to see their entire environment? Let's pick Corporation A. They've got 100 million assets running across the globe. Who's really watching 100 million assets? How do you understand that that is even possible? So where AI starts to come into play is that if you took a similar approach, your first line of defense is actually AI. And AI can examine 100 million devices and say, those 7 look wrong. Something's wrong. I'm seeing stuff happening and I'm noticing a pattern. And this pattern seems to be able to mitigate itself. So I need to cut this off. And this is where firewalls, I mean, as basic as a firewall starts to come into play. Communication from the AI back through a firewall can say, dude, turn all these guys off. They can't talk to anybody in the community anymore. Same with, like I said before, you poured water on your house, right? To not have it burn down. The firewall can actually be utilized in a really effective way, which is start turning off communication, start preventing once I see things that appear very wrong, and start sequestering them and handle it in a way that is much more closer to a disease-driven environment. And that's where AI comes into play.
Well, I think that's a great reminder, and it seems really basic, but every environment is unique. So if we're going to apply a tool like AI, it is much more customizable and turning to your environment and how it needs to be applied. I think that's where a lot of the eye rolling with AI comes in, because they look at these tools and they say, well, they're talking too much about AI because that doesn't really apply to me and this doesn't really work for me. Whereas we need to look at it less off the shelf, over the counter type of offering, and more custom based. I think that may be one of the things that we're struggling with, especially in the OT environment right now.
Yeah, and that's a great point you bring up. And well, I believed a lot of them have approached it erroneously. They have taken very, very basic mathematics, applied it, and assumed it was going to solve their problem. And the reality is, something as simple as knowing you're a male, 5'10", blonde hair, you have certain attributes about you. And now what happens if your hair goes gray? Well, now you start to branch off of that. Well, his hair turned gray. At what age? Oh, well, that mattered. So when he turned 67, his hair turned gray. Now I start to see the world in a way that they're not thinking of. It's all about what you're looking for and how you're looking at it. And I don't believe many companies are capable of handling the sheer amount of data in a real-time basis, which still shocks me, to be able to detect these changes and anomalies and branches and all of this stuff such that it could make very intelligent decisions. And then as a result of those understandings, it could say, dude, now this is where LLMs, shocking, I hate them, but I love one thing about them. They're great at, if I gave it a giant piece of text, it makes it like written nasty, like a programmer would write. It'll come back and be like, oh yeah, that means such and such and such and such and such. It's perfect. That's what I want an LLM to do. Give me the right word so that the end user understands it. Because the way I look at it is the blue screen of death, right? Everybody knows, well, not everybody, but I'm assuming a lot of your audience knows the blue screen of death, and they go, what do I do with this? They're hex codes. You better know assembly. But yeah, so that's the way I see it progressing. I hope that made sense.
No, absolutely. It's just interesting because it's a different mindset. And I think the manufacturing sector has done a good job over time of adjusting to the way we need to forecast, the way we need to manage inventory to a more custom level. We've understood that and we've gotten better at it over time. Now it's taking that and applying it to something like cybersecurity, where right now the focus is on what about my endpoints? What about all the connection points and making it sort of a universal dynamic as opposed to more custom.
So it's funny, you just brought up an amazing point. The first question a CEO will ask you is, how does this make me money?
Yeah.
And the reality is The question should have been, how does this prevent me from losing my company?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't like fright as a result, but the reality is, listen, you got two choices. Don't do it, and best of luck to you. I'm good
Yeah.
with it. I don't care. If you get hacked and they steal all of your information, there's a solid chance you're going to become culpable because you're the
Yeah.
CEO. Your company's going to lose billions, and you're going to pray to God you still have one tomorrow. Up to
Yeah.
you.
Well, and you still
So,
have to you have to report all that to the SEC right now too if you do get hit.
absolutely.
So there's a lot of it, a lot more involved
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, and I know the regulatory world very well. My last company I sold was a compliance company, and it was the same thing with HIPAA. Like, you have to understand, like, it's at the end of the day, this is about, you know, what it is you know and how you report it, how effectively you tell everybody, all this kinds of stuff. Boring as sin, but so don't tell anybody. Just tell your audience, don't listen to that. Um, but
No,
uh, yeah.
I hear you. It's interesting. We could talk about AI and the impacts and changing mindsets. That could be a whole separate topic. I want to shift gears just a little bit because we've talked about a lot of these transitions. These technologies are really shifting the way people need to approach defending and securing their assets or their operational environment. What I'm wondering from your experience, Roland, what do you think have been some of the bigger lessons learned? You mentioned Colonial Pipeline before. We've covered a lot of different hacks that have gotten a lot of attention. What do you think have been some of the things that hopefully manufacturers in particular are learning from some of these bad things that have happened?
So there's a little bit of faith. So at Inside Cyber, one of the things that we try to highlight is that it normally takes somewhere around 200 to 300 days to respond to an attack. And my belief, coming from the world, especially of financial and advertising, was everything is done in real time. So I figure out what's going on in your system instantly. It takes us, I don't know, 20 minutes. I know your entire environment, and I've already started creating things that describe everything. And I've already looked them up and seeing if there are similar things that match you. And the value of that is obviously you're kickstarted without recognizing you're kickstarted. You know what I mean? Like, it used to always be like, wow, we got to look and we got to check and no, you don't. There's where AI comes in when done correctly. And then the AI, as it swings around and you have your feedback loops of that is an issue, you start to end up with things that start to flag stuff and notice trends and notice all these things. And, the more and more customers you have, the smarter the systems get. Um, um, I'm not 100% sure I answered your question, so I'm going to ask you to
Well,
give to me again.
well, I think it all bleeds together. I think one of the big things that manufacturers are learning from a lot of these attacks is, yes, we're manufacturers, we make products, but we're also a data company.
Yeah.
We're also have a lot of different other internal irons in the fire, if you will.
Yes, and yes, that was your question, and I believe that they're starting to recognize that the information that they hold is of tremendous value, and they have to protect it. And they are starting to recognize it is taking them too long to respond to a real, when I say listen, every day you're going to get threats. That's just what happens. But a real one, you better know within 12 hours we might have an issue. And I would argue and say that within 1 hour, I would like to be able to tell you that this is not good. And technically, within 1 minute, I would like to tell you this doesn't look good. Like now you're vulnerable here. And now they could start to react in a way that becomes efficient and they feel more comfortable knowing that their factories and their plants, all their robots and all their heavy machinery is not being compromised. Because the last thing you want to find out is that your stuff was compromised and it took 150 days before they decided to swing the arm at 300 miles an hour, right? I mean, there's nothing because you didn't see it. You never saw it happening. So wouldn't it be better for me to tell you, by the way, hey, that was just hacked? So I'm hoping, I mean that genuinely. I'm hoping that guys in the industry, especially in the OT world, recognize how significant their factories are, their components are. And, again, this goes from everything from car manufacturers to anything that runs in a giant factory down to low-level stuff like I said, nuclear power plants. Like you need to know immediately. Like there could be a problem. And what the key is, and this was the big thing we've always said when we started InsightCyber, we always said no false positives, no false negatives. I don't want to tell you that, oh, that could be dangerous. Yeah, so can sitting on a pin, but like it's not going to kill you. What you want to do is guide your customers to a small level of information that they can react upon. And if you do that effectively, they're not looking at 10,000 emails from one of the major companies today. They're looking at 16. And they go, oh, I don't need 400 guys to be doing this. I needed 2. And lo and behold, you saved money, you did it intelligently, you handled your problems. I mean, what more can you ask for? And I'm hoping that industry drifts towards that understanding. I can't guarantee it, but I hope they do.
Well, I think one of the biggest areas that the industrial sector has improved upon is having knowledge of those breaches, of the intrusions, when people are penetrating their networks. Where we're still struggling, I think, is the response dynamic. You mentioned that the 200 to 300 days, I forget if it was IBM, I think it was IBM, put out the average time spent dealing with the attack was like 248 days or whatever the case may be. Yeah. And a lot of that is, hey, we know we got hit. We know that it hit all these different areas, especially with supply chain attacks becoming such a big issue right now. But it's responding to it. Have you seen anything, or maybe what have you seen in going from that, okay, we know we got hit and we know how to deal with that, or we know how to identify that we got hit, but we're not sure how to respond to it yet. How do you make that leap a little bit?
So that is where, like I was mentioning before, this is where the LLMs come into play really effectively. And InsightCyber creates its own set of playbooks that can help guide you through solving the problem. So not only do I alert you when there really is an issue, I also tell you how to resolve it. And with certain levels of confidence. Because, let's be honest. And this was, it's funny, I bring this up, but this was this was a great conversation when we started Inside Cyber. We had the conversation about if I tell you how to do it, how do I know I'm right? And
Yeah.
because the right answer is always unplug the machine. And reality is you can't necessarily unplug the machine. So setup allows you to say these are the ones that really matter. And when they really matter, those are the ones that I focus on and make sure that if anything touches them, you are alerted immediately. The other machines, I will also tell you if there's communication with them, because it can go back and forth and all that kinds of flow, and you know how this works, especially at a TCP level or even a Modbus level. It doesn't really matter. Um, but you can at least look at something, get it quickly enough that you can react on it with a set of guidelines that give you a confidence of how effective I believe this will be based off of historical data that has shown me these are the possible options. And, yours may not be like number one, turn off the machine, right? You'd be like, I can't turn off the machine. Okay. Number two, so you have these with so much confidence, and the user should understand, and they can add pieces to it and strengthen it and make it smarter to fit their need because everybody is unique. And that's the way Inside Cyber approached it. It's you're unique. So I get it.
Yeah.
It's all good.
In manufacturing, it is tough to turn off the machine, and that's one of the reasons. One of the bigger issues that we have is we see an influx of these vulnerabilities. Verizon just came out with their report, and they talked about this 180% spike in vulnerabilities and how the hackers are taking advantage of those before we can get patches on them. That's a huge issue in manufacturing because even when we know about these vulnerabilities in an automation system or an ICS, we can't get the patch on there quick enough. What's been your experience in trying to deal with some of those exploits and get going without unplugging the machine?
So what we have done is to recognize traits of a machine similar to the way, it sounds terrible, diseases work.
We said that before, yeah.
Yeah, in the sense that if you knew a really good example is only because it's one that is well known. If you had breast cancer, the likelihood of breast cancer, they tell you, right? So if your setup says this setup is I've noticed a trend and I've noticed a pattern and I've noticed your deviation from the norm, and this is very indicative of being highly vulnerable. So I tell them. And why is it vulnerable? And I tell them. It's vulnerable because you're something stupid. You're allowing, whatever, port 80 open, right? Like something as dumb as that. But it's never that dumb. I wish it was. It would make my job so much easier. But this way you can curtail all of the noise and have customers focus and understand that there is a difference between risk and vulnerability. And risk is a score. Vulnerability means this is what you're potentially exposed to. So if you sort of isolate those, you end up with a very fascinating world. And I noticed a lot of companies don't. It starts to become very indicative of how frightening it is for your setup to be the way it's set up. And if you present it back to the customer in a way that explains why, does it rationally, doesn't scare the death out of them, just says, listen, you're fine. However, understand that you have a lot of vulnerability. That's a big deal. And risk is more once it's hit you. What can happen now? And if you separate those two, how susceptible something is to becoming bad, vulnerability is highly different than how dangerous it is that you have something. Because I mean, imagine I put I don't know, a virus on your kids. I'm assuming you have kids on your on your kids' Xbox. Who cares? Like at the end of the day, does it necessarily matter? They're just trying to steal a credit card. But it's not the end of the world, and you can always call Microsoft and they'll give you your money back and you're done. But if that thing was connected to every server in your house, now we got a different game to play.
Well, it's interesting because, Roland, a lot of stuff you're talking about here, it feels like assessing your situation and prioritizing it based on function, risk, mitigation, all of that kind of stuff. Does that feels like it could be a cultural dynamic in terms of you could get into some real turf battles there in terms of, well, to me, this is a higher priority. You say it's a 5. Over here, they say it's a 3. I think it's a 1. How do you kind of deal with some of that?
So the best way to handle that is, well, first of all, you give the user the opportunity to set at the admin level to say, when one of these comes in, this is the level I want it to start at. And if I go up, they know that it means something relevant. If they come back and they say, that was nothing, don't worry about that. Like a great example, which I've used a lot, is a port scan, right? Like a port scan, first of all, it is relatively innocuous, and it could have been performed by the company without a doubt. Like they're doing a port scan to make sure nothing's open. I'm going to tell them, hey, by the way, I just noticed an entire port scan of your entire system. And you're going to tell them, and they're going to say, don't worry about it. And then again, you have to understand, okay, where did it emanate from? How was it? And then how do I suppress that? So the key thing starts to become user feedback. Without any user feedback, it's impossible. A user has to tell me this is dumb. Don't worry about this. It doesn't, I'm not building robots. I'm building intelligent systems. And the goal is for us to think about how to approach these problems and how the user can interact with them and provide a feedback mechanism that helps us understand their environment better than they do. And the more information they give, the smarter we get for their specific environment. And that's where it becomes massive.
Well, that's where a more systemic and a different mindset approach, a systematic approach and a different mindset and going after it is going to be a big part for us going forward in the industrial sector. So, Roland, this has been great. I love the analogy to an infectious disease in terms of using that approach for cybersecurity. And we've talked a lot about changing the mindset and some other things that are exciting with AI. In closing up here, I've got kind of a loaded question for you, and I know this could go either way, but when you're looking at all of these different ways that the bad guys can get at us, especially in the OT environment, I'm just wondering, are we over-connected? Do we have too much stuff talking to each other? Is there too many connections to the internet, all that kind of stuff?
Yes.
All right.
Were you expecting yes?
I've seen it go both ways, because we want to embrace all this new technology that we have and all this automation.
Does your refrigerator really need to talk to your TV? Let's
Right.
be honest.
Right.
There's way too much communication going on. You do not know where the chips were manufactured. I've seen a Philips light bulb make a communication to China. Seriously?
Wow.
So, yes, stop it. Everybody thinks that this beauty of ease is all of these things talk to one another, and I touch my iPhone and I can turn my heat on and do this and do that. That is being sent somewhere. They run their, I don't even know what the hell they're called because I don't own any. Whatever, the Amazon little thing. Yeah. Like, why do you think it always knows what it is you're interested in? Has it ever occurred to any of you that, like, dude, how is it possible you went and shopped on Google and the first ad that came up was what you were talking about last night? That's creepy. And I am from the ad world, and I know how to leverage that game like nobody's business. So don't do that. So that's why I say, yeah, they're all too, as they would say, they're all too chatty. They talk too much. Shut up once in a blue moon and just listen. And if somebody asks you a question and you know it's internal, you could respond. Don't talk outside. Don't communicate to tell my refrigerator repairman that you need to be fixed. Tell me. Like, it's not that complicated, but they have specifically set it up to be very chatty.
Thanks, Roland. And for more information on InsightCyber, you can check them out at insightcyber.com. I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Roland Cozzolino, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.